America's banking crisis is snowballing. Two US banks have collapsed, and now the crisis is hitting the rest of the world. Yesterday, the US president tried to calm nerves. Joe Biden said the depositors will be made whole, meaning they'll get their money back, and that the US taxpayers will not foot the bill for this. But what about the others? What about people in other countries who are also suffering the consequences? Let me tell you how big the fallout is. The failure of American banks has led to a loss of over $400 billion the world over. $400 billion. This is the loss in financial stocks worldwide, and the bleeding is still on amid a crisis of confidence. So how is India faring? How much are Indian companies exposed to this crisis? Well, there are some, and India has not been unaffected by all of this. Tonight, we'll discuss which companies have been hit and how much. But first, an update on what's happening in the US. The American banking system is still reeling. On Monday, customers were still lining up outside SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, the first bank that failed in this crisis. Government officials tried to contain the panic. Remember, American regulators have now taken control of the bank. They are the ones in charge, and they're trying to revive the bank. Yesterday, some officials stepped out to meet customers. They bought donuts and coffee and offered words of reassurance.
You will be able to transact business as usual. Your accounts are safe. Your online portals are active. You'll be able to wire and do business as usual. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know.
So what's happening at SVB right now? The bank is running, but it's not fully operational. They've got a new CEO. Reports say customers have got access to their deposits, but they cannot make cross-border transactions yet. It will take a few more days for the bank to resume all its services. And this is bad news for some startups in India. Like I said, Indian companies have also some kind of exposure to this bank. Some Indian startups had accounts in Silicon Valley, and now their money could be stuck. How many companies are we talking about? More than 60, according to one claim. And how much money is stuck here? We do not have the exact figure, but each of these companies has more than $250,000 in their accounts, and out of these, nearly 24 startups have more exposure, meaning at least 24 companies have more money in the bank. We're talking about more than $1 million each. This money is stuck. And which companies are these? We do not have the names. They've not been revealed yet because this disclosure will hurt them. Apparently, their investors are afraid. They're worried that if the names come out, it will hurt the companies in future fundraising. And who are these investors? The likes of Y Combinator, Accel, Sequoia India, Lightspeed, SoftBank, and Bessemer Venture Partners. These are all venture capital firms. Basically, they're big investors in startups, and this is a testing time for them. Imagine if one of these companies has to pay salaries in India with the money stuck in America. Or if they have to settle vendor payments here, or bills of any other kind. As of today, they cannot do it from Silicon Valley Bank. That's because the bank is yet to resume cross-border transactions. And this bank is central to their businesses. Like I told you yesterday, Silicon Valley was a top banker for America's tech industry. Also for many venture capitalists. Many startups put their first checks in Silicon Valley. The past few days have been a nightmare for them. Here's an American entrepreneur sharing his horror story.
The last 72 hours has been sort of an extreme version of that. I mean, not knowing whether or not the company you've spent 5 years building was going to go away overnight as a result of something as, I think, sort of unpredictable as a collapse of a bank was really hard.
And here's the scariest part. Silicon Valley could be just the tip of the iceberg. America's banking industry at large remains vulnerable. That's because this collapse is linked to US treasuries or US government bonds. Again, we talked about this yesterday. Silicon Valley Bank had a lot of cash. It invested this money in government bonds. But last year, when the US Federal Reserve hiked interest rates, it issued new bonds. These new bonds offered higher interest rates, and that made the old bonds less valuable. Their value declined sharply. And that's a problem for a lot of American banks because many of them still hold the old government bonds. They paid a lot of money for these old bonds. But now if they sell them, they'll not be able to recover that money. In other words, they're sitting on a pile of losses. Do you know how much? Losses worth a whopping $620 billion. This is what American banks are staring at. Over $600 billion in losses. But I must say here, these are unrealized losses, meaning they exist only on paper as of today. The US banks still hold the old bonds. They don't have to sell them immediately. The banks can wait for the value of the bonds to go up. They can choose to sell them only when the value is up. That way they won't make losses. But if they decide to sell the bonds now, there will be suffering. And this is one of the big reasons why everyone is spooked. This is why investors are worried. They fear that the banks would take more losses. So they're dumping their investment. Shares are being dumped across the board. The result is this: global financial stocks have plunged. Banking stocks from Japan to South Korea to Australia and, of course, America are seeing a sea of red. In 2 days, they have lost $465 billion in their market value. In 2 days. The next few days could be tough. The global banking system remains on the edge.